all organisms on planet Earth are dynamic as they are constantly changing due to their interactions with various biotic and abiotic factors. At any point in time, in a population, some organisms are born, some die, some immigrate, while some emigrate. These four processes are known as natality, mortality, immigration, and emigration, respectively. Natality is the number of births in the population that are added to the initial density during a given period, while mortality is the number of deaths in the population during a given period. Immigration is the number of individuals of the same species that come into a particular habitat from elsewhere during a given period, while emigration is the number of individuals of a population who leave a particular habitat and go elsewhere during a given period. In a population, natality and immigration result in an increase in population density, while mortality and emigration result in a decrease in population density. Now, let's consider this flow diagram where n is the population density at time t. Now, the density at time t plus 1 can be calculated as shown. Although the number of births and deaths greatly influence population density, in some cases, immigration and emigration assume importance. For instance, if a newly formed habitat is colonized by great egret birds, the immigration of the egrets has a greater significance in determining the population density rather than the natality in this population. Likewise, if most of these birds fly to another wetland, then the emigration of these birds has a significant contribution to determining population density rather than deaths in this population. Thus, populations grow through births and immigration and decline through deaths and emigration. Growth is the most fundamental dynamic feature exhibited by populations. Interestingly, population growth exhibits two patterns: exponential growth and logistic growth. Let's understand these patterns in detail. When resources available to the individuals in a population are unlimited, there is a tendency of the individuals to grow exponentially or in a geometric manner. This behavior was observed by Charles Darwin while he was developing his theory of natural selection. He also showed that a slow-growing animal, such as the elephant, could also reach enormous numbers if resources such as food and space were inexhaustible. Let's take the example of the pistia plant. When it is introduced in a water body, due to unlimited food and space, these plants grow exponentially and cover the entire water body in a matter of a few days. Considering the population size as n, birth rates as b, and death rates as d, the increase or decrease in population size during a unit time period t is as shown. The difference between the birth and death rates provides the value of r, or the intrinsic rate of natural increase. This is a very important parameter for measuring the impact of biotic or abiotic factors on population growth. The intrinsic rate of natural increase is a measure of the inherent potential of a population to grow. Did you know that the value of R for the Norway rat is 0.015 and for the flower beetle is 0.12? These numbers indicate that the rate at which the population size of the flower beetle increases is greater compared to the Norway rat. Now, to determine the population growth pattern of the Pistia plant, we plot various readings of population density against time. On plotting the readings, you will notice a J-shaped curve which shows two phases, a lag phase followed by an acceleration phase. Moreover, with the basic knowledge of calculus, you can derive the integral form of the exponential growth using the equation as shown. Thus, an exponential growth pattern is seen when resources are unlimited. However, when resources are limited, the population growth pattern is logistic. There is always competition between individuals for limited resources, and finally, the fittest individuals survive and reproduce. Keeping this fact in mind, the governments of many countries have introduced various restraints to limit human population growth. In fact, in nature, a given habitat has sufficient resources to support a maximum number of individuals, beyond which no further growth is possible. This maximum capacity or limit is called the carrying capacity of the species in that habitat, which is denoted by the letter K. Let us consider the population growth pattern of the mandarin duck in this wetland. For this, we plot various readings of population density against time. On plotting the readings, you will notice an S-shaped curve or a sigmoid curve. From the graph, you can see that for a population growing in a habitat with limited resources, there are three phases. Initially, a lag phase, followed by phases of acceleration and deceleration, and finally, an asymptote, when the population density reaches the carrying capacity. The logistic growth is also known as Verhulst-Pearl logistic growth, after the scientists Pierre-François Verhulst and Raymond Pearl, and is described by the equation as shown. In nature, as the resources available for growth are limited, the logistic growth model is considered a more realistic one. Thus, we can say that population density is dynamic and the growth of the population is dependent on the resources available. In every habitat, microbes, plants, and animals interact in various ways to form a community. When populations of two different species interact, it leads to interspecific interactions. Such interactions may benefit, harm, or have a neutral effect on one or both species. In mutualism,
both species benefit from interaction. While in commensalism, the interspecific interaction is beneficial to one species and neutral to the other. In the case of amensalism, one species is harmed and the other remains unaffected. Let's begin with mutualism. Plants and animals show diverse and fascinating examples of mutualism. Did you know that lichens also exhibit mutualism-type interaction? In lichens, algal and fungal partners live together by mutually benefiting each other. The algal partner provides food to the fungal partner, and in return, the fungal partner provides shelter to the algal partner. Likewise, some higher plants also show mycorrhizal association, in which fungi are connected to the roots of the plant. The fungi help the plant absorb nutrients from the soil, while the plant provides food in the form of carbohydrates to the fungi.
Mutual relationships are also seen between plants and animals. For example, plants take the help of insects, birds and animals for pollination, as well as dispersal of seeds. In return, plants provide these pollinators with juicy nectar, and seed dispersers with nutritious fruits. In fact, a given fig species is pollinated only by its partner wasp species and no other species. The wasp serves as a pollinator, while the fruit serves as an oviposition or egg-laying site. In addition, the developing seeds inside the fruit provide nutrition to the growing larvae. Mutualism is also seen in many orchids that have evolved to attract the right pollinator insect and ensure that pollination takes place. A fascinating example is the case of a Mediterranean orchid called Ophrys, which uses sexual deceit to get pollinated by a bee species. One of the petals of this orchid resembles a female bee in size, color, and markings. A male bee gets attracted to this petal, which he perceives as a female, and pseudo-copulates with the flower. During this process, the pollen of this flower gets dusted on the bee. Now, when this bee pseudo-copulates with another flower, it transfers the pollen to this flower, thereby pollinating it. However, during evolution, if the female bee's color patterns change, then the success of pollination will decrease unless the orchid flower co-evolves such that its petals continue to resemble the female bee. This is how co-evolution operates in nature. Apart from mutualism, another interspecific interaction is commensalism, seen in plants, animals, and the aquatic world. A common example of commensalism in plants is seen between an orchid growing on the branch of a mango tree. Although this epiphyte benefits from the interaction, the mango tree is neither harmed nor benefited. Another example of commensalism is seen in leguminous plants such as pea, beans, and lentils, which are associated with the nitrogen-fixing bacteria Rhizobium. The bacteria in the root nodules live symbiotically with the host plant. They obtain nutrition from the host plant and in return fix atmospheric free nitrogen as nitrites and nitrates. Among animals, commensalism can be seen between cattle egrets and cattle. Have you ever wondered why these two organisms are found in close association in fields? This is because while grazing, the cow stirs up insects hidden in the vegetation, which are otherwise difficult for the egrets to locate. Another fascinating example of commensalism is seen between sea anemone and clownfish. Although the sea anemone has stinging tentacles, the clownfish finds it a comfortable place to live as it receives protection from predators. However, in this interaction, the sea anemone is neither benefited nor harmed. Apart from commensalism and mutualism, amensalism is another interspecific interaction seen in nature. In this interaction, one species is harmed and the other remains unaffected. Usually in this type of interaction, an organism oozes a chemical compound which is detrimental to another organism. For example, the black walnut tree exudes a substance called jaglon into the soil, which damages the roots of neighboring plants, thereby preventing other plants from growing nearby. Another common example of amensalism is shown by Penicillium, a bread mold which secretes penicillin, a chemical that kills or stops the growth of bacteria. In this manner, various species exhibit interspecific interactions like amensalism, commensalism, and mutualism that aid in their overall survival and reproduction. In any habitat, plants, animals, and microbes interact in various ways to form a community. When populations of two different species interact, it leads to interspecific interactions. Such interactions may benefit, harm, or have a neutral effect on one or both species. Using a plus sign for beneficial interaction, minus sign for detrimental or harmful interaction, and 0 for neutral interaction, the possible outcomes of the interspecific interactions are shown in the table. During competition, both species lose out during the interaction, while in parasitism, the interspecific interaction benefits one species and harms the other. During the stages of evolution, several species may have competed with each other for survival. Darwin had therefore mentioned that competition was a powerful force in the organic evolution as species struggled for survival. Competition may occur between closely related species, for instance, sheep and goat grazing the same meadows in the Himalayas, as well as unrelated species for the same limiting resources. For example, the visiting flamingos and the resident fish in the shallow lakes of South America compete for zooplankton, their common food. In some cases, limiting resources may not lead to competition. This is because the feeding efficiency of one species is reduced in the presence of another species, even if resources are abundant. Such a competition is known as interference competition. Therefore, competition is best defined as a process in which the fitness of one species, measured in terms of its intrinsic rate of natural increase, or R, is significantly lowered in the presence of another species. To explain competitive release, Connell conducted field experiments on the rocky sea coasts of Scotland using Balanus and Cathamalus. The experiment showed that the larger and competitively superior barnacle Balanus dominated the intertidal area and excluded the smaller barnacle Cathamalus from that zone. However, some recent studies do not support such generalizations about competition. Although they do not reject the occurrence of interspecific competition, they propound that species facing competition might evolve mechanisms to promote coexistence rather than exclusion. One such mechanism is resource partitioning. That is, if two species compete for the same resource, they could avoid competition by choosing different developing or foraging patterns. For example, two competing species of monkey that consume the fruit of the same species of tree will avoid competition by choosing different trees growing in the same forest. An experiment conducted by MacArthur showed that 5 closely related species of warblers living on the same tree were able to avoid competition and coexist due to behavioral differences in their foraging activities. Apart from competition, parasitism is another interspecific interaction observed in nature. In a parasitic mode of life, the parasite gets food from the host. Thus, parasitism is advantageous and has developed in many taxonomic groups from plants to higher vertebrates. In fact, many parasites have evolved to be host-specific. In such cases, both the host and the parasite tend to co-evolve. That is, if the host develops special mechanisms for resisting its parasite, the parasite too evolves mechanisms to counteract them to continue its association with the same host species. For instance, secretions from the human digestive system help to kill parasites that enter it, while the parasites adapt themselves to resist their host. Besides, many parasites have a complex life cycle as they depend on one or two intermediate hosts or vectors. Did you know that the female mosquito is not a parasite, but is a vector as it carries the malarial parasite Plasmodium? Depending on where parasites live, they are classified as ectoparasites or endoparasites. Parasites that feed on the surface of a host are called ectoparasites, while those that live inside a host are called endoparasites. Some common examples of ectoparasites are ticks, lice, and Cuscuta. On the other hand, tapeworms, and hookworms are examples of endoparasites. Although the life cycles of these parasites have become complex, their morphological and anatomical features have simplified. Since parasites are partially or totally dependent on a host, they have developed special adaptations such as the loss of a digestive system and other unnecessary sense organs such as eyes, a high reproductive capacity, and the presence of adhesive organs or suckers to hold on to the host. Studies show that a large number of parasites are detrimental to their hosts as they make them more susceptible to predation by making them physically weak, reduce their growth, survival, reproduction, as well as reduce the size of their population. Interestingly, a few birds show brood parasitism, in which the parasitic bird lays its eggs in a host's nest for incubation. Additionally, during the course of evolution, the eggs of such parasitic birds have grown to resemble the host's eggs with regard to size and color to minimize the chances of being detected by the host bird. Thus, interspecific interactions such as parasitism and competition guarantee the survival and reproduction of species. On Earth, no single habitat exists with just one species. All species on this planet not only coexist, but also depend on each other for their survival. Plants, for instance, need soil microbes to decompose organic matter into inorganic nutrients which are needed for their growth. Also, many plants depend on birds and insects for pollination. Just as plants depend on animals for their existence, animals too depend on plants directly or indirectly for their survival. As a result, in any habitat, plants, animals, and microbes interact in various ways to form a community. When populations of two different species interact, it leads to interspecific interactions. Such interactions may benefit, harm, or have a neutral effect on one or both species. Using a plus sign for beneficial interaction, a minus sign for detrimental or harmful interaction, and a 0 for neutral interaction, the possible outcomes of interspecific interactions is shown in the table. When both species benefit from the interaction, it results in mutualism. On the other hand, if both species lose out during the interaction, it results in competition. In both parasitism and predation, the interspecific interaction benefits one species while it harms the other species. However, when interspecific interaction is beneficial to one species and neutral to the other, the interaction is known as commensalism. On the other hand, if the interaction of one species is harmed and the other is unaffected, the interaction is known as amensalism. Interestingly, a common feature seen in predation, parasitism, and commensalism is that the interacting species live close together. Let's look at predation in detail. When members of one species called the predator feeds on another species called the prey, the interaction is known as predation. For plants, herbivores are the predators, which in turn are predated by carnivores. In fact, predation helps in the transfer of energy from one trophic level to another. Apart from functioning as conduits for energy transfer, predators also help to keep prey populations under control. In some cases, the prey species grows so large that it may cause instability in the ecosystem. For example, due to the absence of natural predators in a specific geographical area, the introduction of an exotic species such as the water hyacinth causes it to grow and spread fast and wide. For example, the introduction of a prickly pear cactus into Australia in the early 1920s created havoc as this plant spread rapidly into millions of hectares of rangeland. The spread was brought under control only after the introduction of a moth, Cactoblastis cactorum, a cactus-feeding predator from South America. Such biological control methods are also used to control agricultural pests. Another function of predators is to help maintain species diversity, thereby minimizing the intensity of competition among competing prey species. For example, a starfish, Pisaster, is an important predator in the rocky intertidal communities on the American Pacific coast. It feeds on a mussel, Mytilus, and is responsible for maintaining the species diversity in intertidal communities. In an experiment, all the starfish were removed from an enclosed area. This resulted in the rapid expansion of the mussel population, and more than 10 invertebrate species became extinct within a year due to interspecific competition. The interaction between Pisaster and Mytilus thus helped maintain the species diversity in these communities. If a predator is highly efficient, it can overexploit its prey, thereby resulting in the extinction of its prey and eventually itself. However, such a situation rarely occurs in nature, as predators are prudent. They do not kill too many prey and leave some for later. Several prey species too have evolved various defenses to lessen the impact of predation. Some species of insects and frogs use camouflage to protect themselves from predators. Moreover, some prey contain poisonous chemicals which keep predators away. For instance, the monarch butterfly contains a chemical that makes it highly distasteful to predator birds. Interestingly, the butterfly acquires this chemical in its caterpillar stage by feeding on a poisonous weed. These are some ways in which animals escape predation. But how do plants protect themselves from predation by herbivores? In fact, nearly 25% of insects are phytophagous, which means they feed on plant sap and other plant parts. Therefore, plants have developed a variety of morphological and chemical defense mechanisms against herbivores. The presence of thorns and spines is the most common morphological means of defense in some plants like acacia and cactus. Also, a few plants like Calotropis and some fungi have chemical defense mechanisms which include the production of harmful and distasteful chemicals. These chemicals make the herbivore sick, inhibiting its digestion impacting its reproduction, and sometimes may even kill the predator. In fact, the Calotropis plant produces a highly poisonous cardiac glycoside, which is why animals don't consume this plant. Did you know that a wide variety of chemicals such as nicotine, caffeine, quinine, and opium extracted for commercial purposes are actually produced by plants as defenses against grazers? Therefore, in nature, species not only coexist but also show various interspecific interactions, predation being the most common.